From the outside, their home looked peaceful. White walls, trimmed hedges, a porch light that came on exactly at 7. Neighbors would wave and say, "Such a disciplined family," admiring how the boy always said, "Yes, sir," and "Thank you." But inside those walls lived a silence so heavy that even the clocks seemed to tick cautiously. Ethan was 12 when he first began to feel that the word obedience meant something different in his father's world. It wasn't just about following rules, it was about surrender. His father, Richard, believed that discipline was love in its purest form. He was a tall man, his voice always measured, his shirts ironed to perfection. He ran the household like a quiet institution. Dinner at 7:15, study until 9, lights out at 10. And though there were no screams or slaps in ordinary days, there was a weight, a constant, invisible pressure that made Ethan's stomach tighten whenever his father entered the room. His mother, Claire, was gentle but distant. She moved like someone who had learned not to make noise. When Richard spoke, she listened. When he frowned, she softened her tone. Ethan didn't know whether she agreed with his father or just feared him, maybe both. One evening, Ethan sat at the dining table, his homework spread out in front of him. The room was dim, lit by the soft yellow glow of a single lamp. Richard entered, reading a newspaper. He placed it down and looked at Ethan's paper. One math problem wrong. Just one. "Again," his father said calmly. Ethan erased the answer, his fingers trembling slightly. He redid the problem, trying not to make a sound. When he was done, Richard nodded, folded the paper neatly, and left. That was all. No yelling, no lecture, just that cold, surgical tone that made Ethan's heart pound harder than any shout could. Later that night, Ethan overheard his parents talking in the kitchen. His father's voice was low, but firm. "You don't correct a child by letting him get away with small things, Claire. That's how disobedience grows." "He's just a boy. He's trying." Richard sighed. "Trying isn't enough. He has to learn." The next day, when Ethan forgot to clean his shoes before bed, his father didn't say a word. He simply pointed at them in the morning, then at the cane resting quietly in the corner of the living room. That cane, polished, dark wood, thin and perfectly balanced, was part of the furniture. Ethan had never seen it used, but it was always there, waiting. At school, Ethan was the quiet one, polite, reserved, always on time. Teachers liked him. Friends didn't really know him. He laughed when others laughed, but never spoke of his home. When they teased their parents, he stayed silent. When they complained about rules, he looked away. Because in his world, rules weren't just rules. They were survival. Every sound in that house had meaning. The slow footsteps in the hallway, the scrape of a chair being pulled back, the pause before his father said his name. Each moment trained Ethan to listen, to anticipate, to obey before disobedience could even form. But one evening changed everything. It started with a noise, a small crash from upstairs, his bookshelf tipping slightly as Ethan tried to reach a book on the top shelf. Nothing broke, but the sound was enough. His father's footsteps echoed up the stairs, deliberate and heavy. "Ethan," his father called, level. "What happened?" Ethan swallowed. I was just trying to get my book. It slipped." "Did I tell you not to climb on furniture?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry." Richard stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Accidents are the results of carelessness." Ethan tried to explain, but his words tangled. And then his father looked at the cane. Just a glance, and the air changed. "Go downstairs," he said quietly. "Wait in the study." Ethan's legs felt numb. He knew what that meant, even though it had never happened before. His mother appeared at the doorway, her face pale. "Richard, please, it was an accident." Richard didn't look at her. A lesson learned once is better than repeated apologies. Ethan went downstairs. The room was warm, but he felt cold. He stared at the carpet pattern, memorizing its loops and swirls. A few minutes later, he heard the door open behind him. His father's shadow stretched across the floor. "This will hurt," he said softly, "but you will understand why." And for the first time, the sound of the cane sliced through the silence of that perfect house. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't cry, not out loud. The pain was sharp, but what hurt more was the sense that something inside him had shifted. A thread that had held his love and fear together had begun to unravel. Afterwards, his father placed the cane back in its corner, as if returning a tool to its rightful place. "Now," he said, "you'll remember to think before you act." Ethan nodded through tears he tried to hide. That night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and wondered why love needed to hurt. He could still hear his mother's quiet sobs from the next room, and he realized that in this house, even love had rules. Days passed. The marks faded, but the memory didn't. Ethan moved through the house like a shadow, quiet, careful, always listening. His father's voice still echoed in his head. "Now you'll remember." He did remember, every second of it. Richard never mentioned the punishment again. He carried on with his precise routines, reading the paper at breakfast, checking Ethan's schoolwork, inspecting his shoes before bed. But now, the silence between them wasn't just heavy, it was alive. It breathed in the corners of the room, in the clinking of spoons, and the way Ethan's mother avoided looking at the cane in the corner. Sometimes, Ethan wondered if his father even noticed the fear he had created, or if that fear was exactly what he wanted. At school, teachers praised Ethan for his discipline. "You're so mature for your age," they'd say. He smiled politely, but inside, the praise felt like poison. Maturity wasn't something he chose, it was something forced upon him. He began writing things down, small notes hidden inside his notebooks, words he could never say aloud. "I hate him. I don't want to be like him. I wish someone would ask if I'm okay." Each sentence felt like a small act of rebellion, even though no one would ever see them. His mother noticed the change too. She watched him at dinner, how he sat straighter, how he flinched when his father shifted his chair. One night, after Richard had gone to bed, she came into Ethan's room. Her hands trembled as she brushed his hair back. "You know your father loves you, don't you?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. She sighed, eyes glistening. "He just doesn't know how to show it." Ethan looked at her, really looked, and realized she was speaking as much to herself as to him. The days grew colder. Winter light seeped weakly through the curtains. Richard's discipline became even more methodical. Every minute of Ethan's day was scheduled. Homework, reading, chores, sleep. If he was late, even by a few minutes, Richard's expression would darken. Not angry, disappointed. And that disappointment was worse than any punishment. One Saturday, Richard decided it was time for another lesson. Ethan had been distracted while polishing the dining table. A streak of dust remained under the lamp's glow. His father didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, staring at the streak. Then he took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and said, "Bring me the cane." The words hit like a thunderclap. Ethan froze. "Did you hear me?" He did, but something inside him resisted. His legs wouldn't move. His throat tightened. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "Ethan," his father's voice sharpened, "bring it." And then, quietly, almost without realizing it, Ethan said, "No." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop. Richard's jaw tightened. "What did you say?" "I said no." Ethan's voice trembled, but the word felt electric on his tongue. For a brief second, Richard looked genuinely stunned, as if the world had tilted off its axis. Then his expression hardened. "Go to your room."
Ethan obeyed, but for the first time it wasn't fear that moved him, it was defiance. He sat on his bed, heart racing. He can hear muffled voices downstairs, his mother pleading, his father's controlled fury. Then stepfoots. The sound of the cane being lifted. The door opened. Richard stood there, framed by the dim light of the hallway. "You will not speak to me that way." Ethan wanted to scream, to run, to explain, but all he could do was whisper, "You don't listen." And then it happened again.
This time he cried, not from pain, but from the realization that he could no longer see his father as the man he wanted to love. Afterward, Richard said the same thing as before, "You'll remember." But something was different. Ethan wasn't sure he would remember the way his father wanted him to. That night, as the house slept, he got out of bed and went to the living room. The cane stood in the corner, polished, shining faintly in the moonlight. He reached out and touched it, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingertips. It wasn't a weapon. It was a symbol of control, of power, of fear masquerading as love. For a moment, he considered breaking it, snapping it in half, throwing it out the window. But then he heard his father's voice in his head. Cold, calm, steady. Anger is weakness. Ethan set the cane back down. He realized he didn't need to break it. The real rebellion was inside him now, growing quietly. He returned to his room and looked at the wall, the same wall that had witnessed his pain. Then, with a pencil, he wrote on it, just behind his desk, where no one would see. "One day, I'll leave, and I'll never be afraid again." Weeks passed. Nothing seemed to change outwardly. Richard still ruled the house, his routines unbroken. But beneath that perfect order, the structure was cracking. Ethan's grades began to slip. He forgot chores. When his father corrected him, he didn't flinch anymore. He stared back, silent but unyielding. It wasn't open rebellion. It was quiet, deliberate disobedience. A refusal to feel what his father wanted him to feel. Richard noticed, of course, and that frightened him more than anger would have, because control only works when fear remains. And for the first time, Ethan was no longer afraid.
The winter that year felt endless. Frost clung to the windows like fingerprints that wouldn't fade, and silence filled the spaces where laughter should have lived. Ethan spoke less and less. Even his mother had stopped trying to mediate. She moved like a ghost between rooms, afraid to disturb the fragile calm that hung over everything. Richard, meanwhile, was restless. Something about the boy's quiet unnerved him. It wasn't obedience anymore. It was distance, the kind of silence that didn't come from respect, but from withdrawal. He would watch Ethan from across the table, searching for signs of rebellion or guilt, but all he saw was a stillness that frightened him. The boy no longer looked scared. He looked detached. One evening, after dinner, Richard asked, "Do you understand why I'm hard on you?" Ethan didn't look up. "Because you think fear keeps me safe." The answer landed like a slap, but there was no anger in Ethan's voice, only truth. Richard's jaw clenched. "Do you think I enjoy punishing you?" Ethan's eyes lifted then, tired, unblinking. "I think you don't know how to stop." For the first time in his life, Richard didn't have a reply. That night, he sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting long shadows over the floor. The cane stood where it always had, gleaming faintly under the light, his reflection warped in its polished surface. He thought of his own father, the same discipline, the same cold logic. Pain teaches order. He had believed it once. Maybe he still did. But something inside him had shifted. He couldn't deny what he saw in his son's eyes. Not fear, but sorrow. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Ethan wasn't in his room. The window was open, the bed neatly made. Richard's heart sank. He stepped outside, the air sharp, heavy with mist. He saw footprints in the frost, leading toward the edge of the woods that bordered our neighborhood. He followed them, his breath coming fast, his shoes crunching over the frozen ground. His voice, for once, wasn't commanding. "Ethan! Son!" No answer, only the distant hum of wind. After nearly an hour, he found him, sitting by the small frozen creek, his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at his reflection in the ice. "Ethan," Richard said softly, almost uncertain, "you'll catch your death out here." The boy didn't move. "You always say that, like you care about my body more than my heart." Richard took a slow breath. "I've done what I thought was right." Ethan's lips trembled. "You thought pain made me stronger, but it only made me quiet." Those words cracked something inside Richard that no amount of authority could hold together. He kneeled beside his son, the frost crunching beneath his knees. "I didn't mean to—" "Yes, you did," Ethan whispered. His eyes glistened. "But I think you hate yourself for it." It was the first time Ethan had ever spoken to him without fear. Richard looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held the cane, that had taught lessons, that now trembled uncontrollably. For years he had believed that discipline was love expressed through control. But in that moment, staring at the boy who no longer flinched, he saw what he had really created. Obedience without love, silence without peace. "I don't know how to fix it," he said finally, his voice cracking. Ethan looked away. "Maybe you can't." The words lingered between them, as cold and clear as the air itself. They walked home together, not speaking. The distance between them felt vast, but something had shifted. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but recognition. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He went into the living room, picked up the cane, and stared at it one last time. Then he opened the fireplace, fed the wood into the flames, and watched it burn. The smell of varnish filled the room, sharp, bitter, cleansing. Ethan watched from the hallway. He didn't say a word, but for the first time he saw uncertainty in his father's eyes, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of remorse. The next day was quiet. No shouting, no commands, just the sound of the clock ticking, a rhythm that suddenly felt human again. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to appear. Richard stopped inspecting his son's work. He let him make mistakes. They started eating breakfast in silence, but it was a different kind of silence, not filled with fear, but with something like rebuilding. Ethan still carried the weight of everything that had happened. Sometimes at night he'd trace the faint scars on his hands, reminders of the days when pain was supposed to teach him love. But now he understood something deeper. Obedience without love isn't respect, it's survival. Years later, when he was grown, Ethan would tell this story to no one. Not out of shame, but because it lived inside him like a quiet truth. He would stand in his own kitchen one evening, watching his young son knock over a glass of milk and burst into tears. For a moment, an old voice whispered in his head, "Show him control, make him remember." But instead, he knelt, smiled softly, and said, "It's okay, we'll clean it up together." That night, as his child slept peacefully, he looked out the window, at the same kind of frost that once covered his childhood home, and whispered to himself, "The chain ends here." He never saw his father again after leaving home at 17, but every now and then, when winter rolled in and the nights grew long, he'd dream of that house. The flicker of firelight, the smell of burning wood, the sound of silence finally breaking. The cane was gone, but its ghost lingered, not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder of what love should never become. And though the past could not be rewritten, Ethan had found something his father never did. Peace born not from fear, but from the courage to forgive without forgetting.